What is up, you guys? Welcome to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name's Mackenzie. If you're not new, thank you for coming back. So today's video is another one that's going to be kind of going back to the basics. It's going to be all about soldering. So everything to do with soldering, your soldering iron, attaching jump loops, what metals can be used, patina, all that fun stuff. So if that sounds like something you're into, stick around, make sure you're subscribed, like this video at the end if you do. Let's get into it. All right, guys, so as always, before I get into actually demonstrating anything and physically showing you guys how I solder, I want to go over all this stuff. So let's go over everything, that way you know what I'm referencing and you can put a visual picture to some of these things you may not even own yet. So we're gonna go over all this stuff, then a little bit later in the video, I'll actually physically show you how I solder, how I make a bead on my outside edges, all that fun stuff. So if you see me looking down, I've got my notes in a notepad right here in a pen, just so I don't miss anything. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm looking at. All right, so let's go over solder and our soldering irons. So whether you're making stained glass or just soldering in general, I know it is really tempting to go the cheap route, go on Amazon and pick up just one of those $20 soldering irons. Trust me, I did it too, but I paid the price. It's worth it to just pay a little bit more money and get yourself a temperature controlled soldering iron. I use this. This is just a Hakko FX601. It's under $100, but it's temperature controlled, and that's the most important thing. If you get a soldering iron that just runs at a specific temperature, you're gonna have a 50-50 shot every single time you turn that thing on that it's gonna, one, run too hot, or two, run too cold. And specifically with stained glass, chances are when you're starting out making just sun catchers or using lead cane, you're gonna need 50-50 solder and 60-40. Both of them run at different temperatures. So you need to be able to see what temperature your iron's at and adjust it accordingly to whatever solder you're using. So if you have a soldering iron that doesn't have a temperature control, you're going to, one, burn through your tip, two, just struggle the entire way because it's too hot or too cold, or three, just end up giving up because it's not performing the way it should. So just spend the extra few dollars if you can, get yourself a temperature controlled iron. It will be worth it in the long run. It's going to be much less of a headache. So with that being said, let's talk about tip tinner. So all tip tinner is basically something that you put on the tip of your iron to prevent holes and to protect it from oxidation and all that fun stuff. So tip tinner is a lead-free, thermally stable, oxide-reducing compound, and we put that on the very tip of our tin. You're gonna hear me say tinning later. I'm talking about something else when we're actually talking about tinning our stained glass piece, but you also tin the tip of your iron. Now, all tinning means is just lightly coating something in solder. So tinning is just a light coat of metal on top of whatever you're tinning. So to be able to actually pick up and hold a bead of solder, your iron needs to be perfectly tinned. And again, tinning is making that nice light coat of metal around the tip of your iron. You can see right here, hopefully this is focusing okay, it's all corroded and gunky looking because it's old, and then you have your beautifully tinned bright silver tip. So that's one way to tell if your tip is tinned. And two, when you go to pick up a bead, if your iron keeps dropping it or you just can't really even melt anything, it's probably because your iron isn't tinned. So there are a few different ways to tin it. You literally buy tip tinner. So these are my favorite. They come in these little metal jars. Of course, I'm going to link everything I can down below for you guys. And it literally just says tip tinner. I think it says, okay, so it's from Thermaltronics and it's just called a tip tinner. So it looks almost like a sandy substance if sand was a solid form. And this one just happens to be gray. And as you dip your soldering iron into it, I'll show you this later, it melts and it starts to coat the tip of your iron with the tip tinner. So like I said before, if you don't have your iron tinned, you could risk burning a hole. So every single time we turn our soldering iron on, the tip of our soldering iron is heating up very, very, very hot. So we know, to be exact, So 50-50 is melting right at 418 degrees Fahrenheit, and 60-40 is right at about 374 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's hot. That is really hot, and as that's heating up, if you don't have tip tinner on your iron, your soldering iron is going to be heating the physical tip of the iron itself instead of heating the metal that is tinned on the outside of it. Does that make sense? So when we turn this on, if it didn't have that coat of metal tinned on the outside, the iron heats up and it is heating the physical tip versus heating the tin that should be on the outside. Now, the problem with that is, once it does that enough, you are going to burn a literal hole through the tip of your iron. I've done this. So I got one of those crummy $30, $20 soldering irons off Amazon, and I was struggling so bad to pick up a bead of solder. Every single time I was digging more and more and melting more and more solder onto the tip, and it just kept dropping it. It wouldn't build a good bead. I couldn't do anything. And then eventually I turned my iron on and there was a literal hole through the tip of my iron because I didn't have it tinned properly. So you gotta have it tinned properly. Again, there are different kinds. This is a tinning block right here. It comes in a box just like this. You can get all this stuff on Amazon. This one's not my favorite. I find that these harder forms don't really work as well. They don't melt as quickly, but of course I'll link this one too. Everybody likes something different. So all it is just a straight up tinning block. Looks like a bar of soap. And like I said, it's a lead-free, thermally stable, oxide-reducing compound. So that's all we need to know. We melt it, tins our tips, fantastic. But again, this one's gonna be my favorite right here. I don't know why, it melts easier and seems to really clean the tip as it's coating it, which leads me to this. So this little thing right here is called a tip cleaner. And it's basically, if you guys have ever used like a Brillo pad or something, it's like one of those, but it's gold. So if you wanted to use one of these, you would turn your soldering iron on. It's nice and hot, yeah. After it's super hot, you stick this thing in here, back up a little bit, and scrape your soldering iron back and forth. If you don't have your iron deep enough into the cleaner, you are going to shoot molten solder everywhere. So make sure you've got your tip in there deep enough, scrape it around, and it's going to get rid of all this oxidation and gunk on your tip. Then you can tin it if you need to and move on. So as we're talking about tip cleaners, let's talk about our sponge. I've heard that some people don't even use damp sponges as their soldering. All they use is this. I tried it, did not work out for me at all. So it's a very rare occasion that I use this. I use a damp sponge all the time when I'm soldering. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I use a damp sponge a lot more than most people. And because of that, I think I am tinning the tip of my iron a lot more than most people. So every single time I put clean solder on or make a nice pass, maybe I'll do 5, I'll wipe off my soldering iron tip onto the sponge. So you'll see it when I demonstrate, but I just wipe each side off and put fresh clean solder on. That works for me. Some people have asked if I experience a deep temperature change, like if I wipe off my soldering iron on my sponge, do I have to wait a second before it heats back up again? No, I've never experienced that. I wipe it off a lot. It's almost just a habit that I've built in by now, and I haven't experienced really any downsides to it. It's just my favorite way to work. And like I mentioned before, that's all this is all about, right guys? So as long as your piece is made with integrity and it is structurally sound, it does not matter how you got there, right? Doesn't matter how you got there. Everybody in life does everything differently. So if somebody uses this over me using a sponge, I'm not right and they're wrong, or they're not right and I'm wrong. We just do it differently. That's the beauty about life and art and anything in general. Everybody can do stuff differently, but as long as we have the same end result, then it doesn't matter, right? So now that we've gone over that, let's talk about solder. So where to even begin? So I think there are a lot of misconceptions about lead-based solder and stained glass because of the lead-based solder. but reality is it does not pose any danger whatsoever. So as we're soldering, we know that there are fumes coming up off of our piece. That's not solder, that's flux, and that's dangerous. So whether you're using a lead-based solder or a regular solder, the flux is what you need to protect yourself from. So that can cause all different types of respiratory issues. You guys can do your own research on that. I'm not a doctor. So we know we're protecting ourselves from flux. Let's talk about what it is that scares people about lead-based solder. So we're not making jewelry, we're not eating our lead-based solder, we're not wearing it, we're making stained glass. So as long as you're not having prolonged contact with your skin, you're not grinding this up and consuming it, there's nothing for you to worry about. We're not wearing it, we're not eating it, unless you're heating up your 60/40 solder or any lead-based solder to the point of evaporation, which would be physically impossible with a soldering iron. It would never get that hot. You're fine. So unless you're heating this lead-based solder to the point of evaporation, you are absolutely fine. There is nothing to be afraid of. Just be in a well-ventilated area. Use a respirator or a fume extractor and you're golden. We're trying to protect ourselves from flux, not from a lead-based solder. Again, if we were making something like jewelry and wearing these pieces for prolonged periods of time, cannot use a lead-based. That's when you would have to use lead-free. Using lead-free solder is a totally different ballgame. So, of course, just like the different mixes of solder, lead-based or not, they all have different melting points. And for some reason, lead-based solder just melts totally different. So building a nice, smooth, solid, lead-free line is a struggle, even for me. It is so hard for me to use lead-based or lead-free solder now. One, because I've probably adjusted to using lovely 60/40, but two, it's harder for everybody. Using lead-free is a totally different ballgame, but good news is we're making stained glass. We have nothing to be afraid of with using lead-based solder. We're afraid of our flux, so we're good to go. So of course you've got 50/50 and 60/40. So you can see right on the top here, it says 50/50 solder, and this one is 60/40. So again, this varies widely between every single artist. And the reason people use 50/50 is really more for lead cane work, or if you have a large gap you need to fill in between your stained glass, you would fill that with 50/50 solder. Then you go back and build up your bead and your edges with 60/40. So 9 times out of 10, I'm using 60/40. I can't tell you the last time I used 50/50 solder, but I will say for those of you that are just starting out, you need to have a roll around. So if you do have large gaps on accident, you can fill it in with 50/50, go back in, build your bead up with 60/40. You gotta have some around. Again, another reason that this is so important, having a temperature controlled iron. So 50/50, 60/40, there are other types of mixes. These are just the most popular, that's why I went over those. So let's talk about an acid core or flux core solder. I do not like these. I think these make a mess. They will burn you, but there is basically flux built inside the middle of this roll of solder. So as you're melting, hot beads of solder and flux are flying off of your soldering iron. I've been burned so many times trying to use a flux-based solder, thinking it was gonna make my life easier, but reality is you're gonna need some type of normal flux, liquid or paste anyway. So don't even bother with the acid core. It makes an absolute mess. It's lead-free, it's just difficult. So let's talk about flux. So you can have different types of flux, and we know we need flux to be able to solder. Without flux, your foil is going to be too dirty, the solder's not going to stick, it's not going to melt and spread out the way you need it to. I personally like liquid flux. There is also a paste flux. I'll see if I can pop up a picture here, but it's just what it sounds like. It is a pasty, gross, messy substance. I don't like it for that reason. I find that paste flux just, it sticks around a lot longer. It doesn't really evaporate as you burn it like liquid does. and it leaves behind a much thicker film and residue than normal liquid does. I don't like paste, but again, this is all preference. I like liquid. I like to put it in my little jar. I find it's a lot cleaner and easier to work with. And I think truly liquid helps that solder kind of spread out and build your bead a lot easier. When you have gunked up paste flux, that's obviously going to cause issues as you're trying to streamline your bead and you're going down the line, but you've got hot chunks of flux and solder flying everywhere. You're probably gonna stop and get burned, and then you have lines in between your solder bead. So I would always suggest just getting a liquid flux. Of course, my favorite brand is Novacan. I use them for everything where I can. I love them, they're fantastic. So we've talked about tip tinner, our soldering iron, having it temperature controlled, having a damp sponge, our tip tinner, tip cleaner. We've talked about solder itself now, talked about flux. Now let's get into when we're done with our piece. So you can have things like patina, optional. You can have things like stained glass polish, optional. And you can have things like actual flux remover, also optional. So I'm sure you guys have heard me say before that I clean my pieces with some warm soapy water and Dawn dish soap, something non-abrasive. This is just another chemical to add to the earth when we really don't need to. Using warm water and soaping up really well with Dawn dish soap works beautifully. That's what I've used my whole career and I've never had any issues with it. But if you're somebody that likes to have all the bells and whistles everywhere you can, getting something like a flux remover might be something you're interested in. So they totally have that. This is going to help you clean off your piece, get rid of all those leftover flux oils and all that stuff. And stained glass polish is exactly what it sounds like, just stained glass polish when you're totally done with your piece. Again, not something I really like. I've found that unless you're using only silver solder, that it doesn't really do much. So it might bring a little bit more shine to the solder, silver solder, but that's really it. That's all I've ever seen it do. So I think it's just another one of those things that's honestly a waste of money. You don't need it. So now let's talk about patina. I get a lot of questions about patina. So patina is optional. You do not have to patina your work. The only reason that I use black patina on pretty much everything is because I like the way it looks, personally. I love the way black solder works. And a little trick, if you're just starting out, you definitely shouldn't rely on this. I probably shouldn't even say this, but using a black patina will definitely help hide imperfections that you may have within your solder. Of course, you always want to strive to put out the best pieces that you can, but when you're beginning, you're just learning, there are going to be imperfections. Patina will definitely help hide those. But there are different types of patina. So all I use is black because obviously I like black, you know what I mean? But there are copper patina, bronze patina. I'll pop up some pictures of what things look like with those, but it's all personal preference. You don't have to finish your piece with any patina. I just happen to like the way that it looks. Again, I'll show you guys when I finish what it looks like to actually use or how to use patina and what the finished product looks like. Let's talk about the fumes that come off flux. So, like I said, it's fumes coming off flux. That's what we need to be afraid of. And with that being said, using something like a mask or a dust mask isn't filtering out fumes at all. This isn't going to do much. So if you insist on wearing this type of mask or a respirator, you still need to be in a very well ventilated area. I will say I've never seen anybody using any type of fume extractor or anything like that, but of course I have to suggest it. I'll be honest with you guys, I don't use it, but I am in a well ventilated area and I will have my windows open. You do not want to be breathing this stuff in. That is just adding risk to your job, and you don't need to, especially right now. The way the world is, the last thing we need is added respiratory issues. So get yourself a fume extractor. They are not that expensive. You can actually get some pretty small ones or a charcoal built-in mask and you'll be all set. Just don't lean over your pieces and breathe in those flux fumes. That's not what you want to do. Okay, so now that we've gone all over that, let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. Oh yeah, so what can you solder? What types of metal can you solder? So we know that we have different types of solder, being lead, tin-based solder, so we know those types of metals can be soldered. But what else? So this right here is a lead-free solder and it's silver. So this is solid silver. We know silver can be soldered then. So when it comes to adding things on our pieces like jump loops, you need to pay attention of what metals they're actually made of. So I wrote down what types of metal can actually be soldered, things like copper, gold, silver, brass, some irons, but of course it also has to be clean. That's what our flux is for. Flux helps clean and smooth out our solder lines. So it's gotta be clean and you gotta pay attention to what type of metal it is. Not all metals can be soldered, technically, and your jump loop obviously has to be a solderable material. Otherwise, when you go to drop that bead on top of your jump loop, the jump loop almost runs away from the bead or vice versa. You wanna drop your bead on your jump loop and have it fully encase the jump loop on its own, once you've got a little bit of flux on there. If it is running away from the bead or vice versa, you know you ain't got the right type of metal. So go back into wherever you purchased it from, see what kind of metal it is and work from there. To be honest, a lot of the time buying jump loops on Amazon, which is something I try to avoid now, you don't really know what type of metal it is. Not only do they not disclose it, but a lot of the time it's not true. So to be honest, it's a trial and error figuring out what kind of or what brand of jump loop works for your solder. But just as a baseline, we know what types of metal work. Using things like silver plated jump loops is not that much more expensive. So if that's something you have to do, just do it. It'll be easier in the long run instead of struggling and ending up with cases of jump loops that you can't use at all. All right, so I think that's everything. We've gone over our solder, all of our cleaners, flux, patinas, having a temperature controlled iron, our sponge, all that fun stuff. Okay, so let's get into actually soldering something and I'll show you guys how I make a perfect bead. All right, guys, I've got you zoomed in nice and close here. I want you guys to be able to see exactly what I'm doing and I want you guys to be able to see the bead as it's actually forming. You're gonna be able to see right where I'm holding my iron and holding my solder. So, for the sake of this video, I've randomly cut, ground, and wrapped a few of these pieces just to be able to show you guys. And I wanted to show you how I mark my pieces out. So say I've got 6 pieces right here. Obviously I would know where these go because they're straight edges and you can see really well with a pattern of glass. But on any other pattern, you want to mark out with Sharpie exactly where your pieces are. That way when you go to put them back together, you have a map of where each piece is supposed to go. And you can mark it obviously any way you need to, however you're going to remember it. I am smushing my pieces as close together as possible, making sure everything is fitting in nice and snug. This right here is my flux. I have poured a little bit of my Novacan flux inside this little jar, that way I don't risk spilling it. I've already cut a few rods of my 60/40 solder. That way I don't have to hold my roll because sometimes I'll be soldering 6, 7, 8 hours at a time and that 1 pound roll gets heavy quick. So it's a lot easier to just pre-cut some rolls than you've only got that to worry about. So I've got my flux in here. I am going to dip my flux in this brush, dip my flux in this brush, give it a nice coat. You don't need too much on your piece. I've got my soldering iron right here to the right. I've got my damp sponge, which I'll show you how I wipe it off in a minute. I just want you up close for this part. So we're good to go. So I've already turned on my iron. First thing I'm gonna do is clean off this tip and recoat it in fresh solder. So I'm going to wipe off my tip. I just wipe each side on the damp sponge and put on a nice coat of fresh solder. See how it's not sticking everywhere? It's not a perfect tin on the soldering iron. So I'm going to wipe that off. I'm going to grab my little tip tinner, pull the cap off, put it down, and I'm just going to gently scrape the tip of my iron back and forth up against the tip tinner. See how nice this one melts? This one's got some nice built-in flux to it, or some types of flux. And all I'm doing is just scraping back and forth melting that tip tinner and really coating my soldering iron. Now before I wipe this off, I'm just gonna let that sit on my iron for a moment. You see how nice and shiny that is? That's super shiny now. So I'm just gonna let that sit over here in its stand. And we can get some flux on our pieces. So again, wipe the majority of that flux off. You don't want it to be drowning in flux. And the first thing we're doing is connecting all of our joints. So we wanna make this piece a solid form as quick as we can. That way it doesn't move around on us. So I'm just gonna drop beads on all of our contact points, right? So over here, I'm gonna do it in these middle and the sides. Now we can move our pieces one, right? So when we move this around, we don't have to worry about putting all these pieces back together again. So as you kind of solder, you'll find that you end up needing to reapply the flux quite a bit. Now, of course, this is something that you're just gonna learn with time, but you can also physically see and feel when your solder starts behaving differently. Again, the point of flux is to clean and help promote our solder to flow smoothly and adhere to our copper foil. So once that stops happening, you know you need to recoat and flux. And the hotter your piece starts to heat up, the quicker that's going to evaporate off. So if it's looking dry, you need more flux. But we've covered ourselves in a nice coat of flux, picking up my iron. Everything is looking nice and coated. So I'm going to drop my iron down, holding my solder rod directly behind my iron, and melting as I go. Nice and slow. Don't flood that space. And just creating a nice smooth bead. If something like this happens where you see a little bit of indent, you can always go back in and fix it later. If you can, I would leave it alone, let that area cool down and go to another spot and you can go back to it later. So let's do that again. I've got a bead here already, so I'm going to start melting my solder rod, holding it right behind my soldering iron, letting it melt as I drag it along the foil, making a perfect solder bead. I've got a little bit extra here, that's okay. That's a perfect bead. There are no breaks in that. So now that I've got a little bit extra on my iron, I'm going to start out, then start melting more solder. That way I don't flood that area. And I'm just going nice and slow, melting as I go. Lift up, join that last bead. Beautiful. Now those are some good looking solder lines, if I do say so myself. Again, all it's taking is practice. I know sometimes when you're watching somebody else do it that's been doing it for a little while, they make it look so easy. Don't get discouraged. You will have solder lines that look like this soon too. So let's do that again. We've got flux over here. Now we've got some joint areas. So what I would do is hit this long one first, then we can worry about our joining edges. So we've got flux. Let's start melting solder, melting as we go, slowly dragging it down our foil line. Don't go so slow that you flood your copper foil. You gotta be right in the middle. Beautiful. So now what I'm gonna do, touch that area up. You could add a little bit more to make a little bit of a bigger bead. That's better. All right, so now I'm gonna go back in and do our joining edges. So what you can do is start out just like you would any other line. And when you get to your joint, pick up your solder and just melt it in. That's it. And it'll join flawlessly. Drop it down on the other side, create that nice thick bead, and lift it up. Easy as that. Don't worry about any little minor breaks. That is still a perfect solder line. If you're really anal like me, you can of course go back in and try to remelt those areas to get rid of those imperfections. So now same thing, starting with the bead, already started melting, holding my solder rod right behind my iron, lifting up because I've already got solder there, I don't want to flood it, and you got to start melting again for the other side. And just slowly dragging it down the foil. Lift up your rod and finish the bead. So, if you really want to fix any of these lines, you can always go back through, add a little bit more solder if you need to, and just pull it through. Beautiful. All right, so before you pick it up, make sure you give it a chance to cool, because that solder is still molten and it will move around on you. That is what it should look like. A nice, well-rounded, thick bead. That's perfect. All right, so now let's get to the outside. All right, that's better. Hopefully you guys can still see okay. But now what we're doing on the outside is, again, essentially tinning. So we know all tinning means is just lightly coating something in metal or solder. So all we're doing is creating a light coat of solder for our edges. Now we're going to lightly coat all of these edges, then we will go back in when we can pick up our piece horizontally to build that nice, beautiful, thick, sturdy bead. Beautiful. All right. So I do want to give these pieces just a second to cool off. That way I can actually physically pick them up. I do have nails, but it's easier to hold a piece with your fingertips. That way it's not slipping and dropping, because we've got to be able to hold our pieces up perfectly horizontal to build our nice beads on our outside edges. All right, so we are cool enough now where I can actually pick up and touch these pieces, which makes it a little bit easier to do our outside edges and create that nice finished, thick, strong bead. So there are a couple ways for you to do this. I'll show you one on one piece and one on the other. So I think this is the easiest way. Again, wiping my iron off on my sponge since it's been sitting there for a second. I'm going to recoat it in fresh solder. And now all I'm gonna do is start dropping beads. Now we pick it up horizontally. All we have to do is meet these beads together, and that will naturally create this nice, big, beautiful bead on the side. So I definitely need to add another bead in here, but all I have to do is pick up from my rod, put another bead down, and connect them together. So I'm just tapping along the edge, melting these big beads that we've already placed, creating that nice, solid, and kind of encourage it to spread out and meet the rest of our melted beads. And that creates that perfect edge. Letting it cool off for a second before I turn it to show you guys. But that has created a nice, thick, rounded edge bead of solder. Again, we're just gonna start dropping and tapping, melting these beads as we go. And that is naturally creating a nice, thick, beaded edge. Beautiful. Just lightly tapping, picking up and dropping. Grab more solder if you need to. And created a perfectly rounded, beaded edge. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. But it is as easy as that. That is one way to do it. So let's just finish off our other two edges with the same technique so you guys can really see what's going on. Look at that. How perfect is that? Super easy, doesn't take very long. And all it is just tapping your iron up and down, and that creates that beautiful, rounded, soldered edge. It's not just foiled, it's not just tinned. That is a nice, strong, soldered edge. That is perfect. That's exactly what you want. All right, so that is a traditional way to do it, but you can also just do it by hand. So what I would do in this situation was take my solder rod, bend it, so it sits up on the table by itself. Do you see that? So I've got about 2 inches up off of the mat. That way, I only need one hand on my glass piece, one hand on my iron, and I can pick up beads as I go. Already holding it horizontal, right? So you can just pick up beads as you go, melt them in, and it's essentially the same technique. You're just not laying down your beads first. Just pick up a nice glob, lay it down. Pick up a nice glob, lay it down. And do that for your whole edge. So they both work, they're both just as easy, and they both make beautiful, rounded, soldered edges. Much, much stronger, much, much nicer looking than just tinning. Tinning is not strong enough for your outer edge. If you're not using lead cane, you gotta do this. All right, now that we've done that, let's jump into jump loops. So like I talked about earlier, we now know that we cannot just use any type of jump loop. You gotta have the right type of metal. So I've got the right type of metal here. And let me show you what it looks like if it's the wrong type of metal. So this cannot be soldered. So let's see. I'm gonna cover this with a ton of flux. Now watch how solder behaves on it. Nothing, not sticking at all. Not even a little bit of solder is being left behind. Look at that. You could drop a bead on the inside of that. That is not gonna stick to your jump loop. You want your jump loop to fully and naturally encase inside your bead of solder. So look at the difference. Now we've got a metal here that can be soldered. These are silver plated. Look at that. Now that is what you want to happen. The solder is fully encasing that jump loop and attaching to the jump loop. That's exactly what you want. If it's running away from the solder, no solder is sticking to it, it is not the right kind of metal. So now we know what that looks like. All right, so when you're attaching jump loops to your piece, you need to look for a joint. So instead of taking a jump loop and running it right up to the edge in the middle of a piece of glass, you need to meet it at a joint. So when you attach your jump loop to a joint, that is giving the solder a bigger surface area to attach and hold on to versus just putting it in the middle. If we soldered it right in the middle here, all of that weight is sitting just on this technically tinned edge. Even though we've got a nice thick bead, it's still not going to be strong enough if your piece is heavy enough. You need to find a joint to attach it to and solder it there. So now I'm going to pick up a good amount of flux. I've got my open edge of the jump loop facing down so it will hide inside. Picking up my iron, I'm gonna put a nice bead and drop it down, fully encasing that jump loop. Putting a little bit extra on the sides, really spreading out that area. So it's got a lot to hold on to and it's not putting a ton of weight on just one area. Beautiful. So now we're gonna let that dry and then we're gonna flip it over. All right, now we can flip it over and this is what the back side will look like. So it looks quite textured, looks unfinished, but we're gonna fix that. So we wanna make sure that we've got a nice thick bead of solder fully encasing these jump loops. This is where the joint comes in. So we want to finish this bead, make it look nice and smooth on the back, and we're going to drag that solder down into our joint. Now, we know that this jump loop isn't putting pressure on the edge of our piece, it is going all the way down into that joint. So that jump loop is not going anywhere. So we're gonna finish it off to look nice and smooth, pull that down into the joint. Beautiful. That is how you attach a jump loop. So we finished our jump loops. That's what it should look like. We know that is nice and strong because that's going all the way down into our joints. Now those pieces aren't gonna go anywhere when we hang them up, right? That is exactly how you wanna do it. Our jump loops are strong and finished. That's exactly what you should be looking like. That'll be the back, this will be the front. All right, so now that we've gone over all of this, we are almost done. The last things we gotta do is clean it and patina it if you so choose. So instead of taking this to a paper towel and going right in and patinaing it, I am not gonna do that. I am going to take it to the sink, give it a nice, good, clean wash with Dawn dish soap and warm water, then we'll be back to patina it. All right, guys, so I gave my pieces a nice, warm, soapy, scrubby bath. Now I am ready to apply the patina. Again, this is optional and you can get different colors of patina. I personally love black, but you can get copper, bronze, whatever you want, or you can just leave it silver. Some people love the silver, but today I'm using black and it is pretty easy to use. So I've got a plastic handled brush here. It's a plastic handled, obviously a toothbrush, I think from Dollar Tree. You want a plastic handle because this is an acid-based product and you don't want it to start to corrode away at your brush. So just grab a plastic handled brush. I've just poured a little bit into the cap. That way I don't have to stick my brush down into the bottle and I don't spill it. And all I'm doing is coating the brush and scrubbing it on. And it is as easy as that. You can be as generous as you need to with the patina. And as you kind of scrub it in, you see it turn black. And if I was using copper, it would turn the metal copper, bronze, etc. So all I'm doing is just dipping it in and scrubbing it on. And that's that. Just gonna wipe my brush off, pour the rest back into my bottle. Now I've got to take this guy back to the sink, give it another nice warm soapy bath, and it is complete. All right, guys, that is it for today's video. Here are our finished example pieces. Our solder lines are looking smooth and beautiful. Obviously, here's the black patinaed one, and here is the regular silver. Fantastic. So that's it for today's video, guys. Of course, my number one thing is just practice. Don't feel discouraged if your solder lines don't look like this yet. It took me a long time before I got to this point and lots of practice. So expect the same for yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself. that's it. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you feel like I left anything out, or if you guys still have questions, please feel free to leave them down below. I'm always around to answer them, and I'm always in the comment section. Everything I used in today's video will be linked down below. And if you want to check out my stained glass work and my stained glass business, that will be linked down below too. And if not, actually, not my normal outro. Don't forget to subscribe if you're still here. Don't forget to like the video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.